happened, the extent of it, the gruesomeness, the audaciousness of this kind of an aerial attack against some of our best known symbols of America. I was not surprised that there was an attack, was surprised at the specificity of this one.
Does the Senate now, to show that the Senate can get on with business and that the U.S. Congress has not been impeded, do you think the Senate ought to come back and get back to business to send that signal?
Well, I think first, as all Americans, we need to extend our sympathy to the families that have been so tragically affected by this. We also need to send a signal to the world that a group of terrorists cannot intimidate the greatest democracy in the history of the globe, and that we will continue to carry out our responsibilities.
And at this briefing, you told me within the hour, before 5 o'clock Eastern, you expect to talk not only with intelligence, FBI, but also with your colleagues, the leadership. Yeah. And I understand some decisions are going to be made about how to proceed from here.
Well, I think what we'll be getting at this briefing is some more detail as to what happened today. But there clearly are some things that we have known that need to be undertaken for our long-term protection. For instance, we need to make a greater investment in human intelligence. That's old-fashioned spies that can get close to a terrorist, find out what their intentions and motivations are. We need to see that our technical ability to gather information stays as world-class as it has been for the last 50 years, and we need to close the gap between the amount of information we gather and that which we're able to analyze and convert into useful intelligence.
Okay. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, joining us here. He's about to receive a briefing, Judy, and we will get back to you with word when we know more from here. Judy?
All right, Kate, we've been listening closely to what Senator Graham was saying, and I would just remind everyone, if they haven't already taken note of this, that this week is actually the anniversary of the Camp David Accords. Those took place back in 1978, 23 years ago, over a period of about a little more than a week, between September 5th and about the 17th. This was the framework for peace in the Middle East, an agreement between Israel and Egypt that many of the more hardline Arab states said they would never forgive Egypt and certainly Israel for doing this. They felt betrayed by it, and there are those today suggesting perhaps that had something to do with the timing, although at this point it would be purely speculation to say one way or another. You're continuing to see pictures of the terrible devastation in New York City in the aftermath of the 2 airplanes that flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. There are adjacent buildings, part of the World Trade Center complex, that are still very much at risk. One of these buildings may have collapsed or may be in the process of collapsing. Aaron Brown, back to you in Manhattan.
Judy, thank you. Jim DeStefano is a structural engineer. He knows about big buildings and what happens in these sort of catastrophic moments. He joins us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. Jim, the plane hits. And I hope this isn't a terribly oversimplified question, but what happens to the building itself?
Well, it's
a structure.
Yeah, it's a tremendous impact that's applied to the building when a collision like this occurs. And it's clear that that impact was sufficient to do damage to the columns and the bracing system supporting the building. That, coupled with the fire raging and the high temperatures softening the structural steel, then precipitated a destabilization of the columns, and clearly the columns buckled at the lower floors, causing the building to collapse.
So it is a combination of, as we see again this extraordinary shot of the second plane hitting the tower, it is a combination of the impact of the plane itself and then the fire that ensues that causes these, I don't know, are they called beams, to buckle?
It's the columns. The vertical elements are columns, and those are the elements that are holding the whole building up. And those are the critical, vulnerable elements that clearly failed in a buckling mode from the high temperatures and the damage from the impact.
Now, I'm not asking you to assign any blame to anyone about anything here, but just give me an idea if, in fact, you can design these buildings in such a way so that it does not, this sort of thing does not happen even in a catastrophic event?
Well, it's very difficult when you're designing a structure like this to imagine all the scenarios of things that might occur to the building during its construction. It's my understanding that when this building was designed, one of the criteria that it was designed for was a direct hit from a 707. Clearly, planes are larger today, and it wasn't considered the effects of the aftermath fires and high temperatures that would have been applied to the structure subsequent to the collision as we saw today.
And to the best that you can, give me an idea of how long it will take for that building to be safe to go into. Because what we know is there, or what we believe at least, there are still people trapped in there. The mayor talked about a week that this rescue operation is going to take. Is that realistic?
I think it's very realistic that what we've seen in other collapses, like L'Ambiance Plaza here in Connecticut and the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City and the Oklahoma City bombing, it takes a very long time to clear the rubble and find all the people that might be trapped underneath it.
But at what point, what has to happen before it is literally safe to send someone into that space?
I don't know that it will ever be safe. I think the rescue people that are in there trying to save people are very much at risk, as they always are in these kinds of disasters. That the structure is always, when you have a pile of rubble like this, the structure is always somewhat unstable. So those rescue workers that are in there are at some risk. That there's never a point where you can say this building is safe to walk into and start looking around.
Jim, thank you. Jim DeStefano, a structural engineer, joining us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. We have, over the last 6 or 7 hours now, shown you some extraordinary pictures. Many of those pictures have come from the air. We have seen the plane hitting the tower. We've seen the tower collapse. In this day and age, lots of people walk around this city, and every city, I guess, with video cameras, and one of them today in Lower Manhattan was Dr. Mark Heath. Dr. Heath kept rolling, as we say in the news business, and this is what he saw with as little commentary from us as possible.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Can I get a toot? I'm just getting a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Oh, wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Don't have oxygen.
Hey!
Can you,
Hello, Doc.
hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, and that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I've seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. No one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. Yeah, that almost made it work. Looking north on the West Side Highway. You guys going in?
Yeah.
Come with you. You know, you might not want to get too much closer because the more buildings could come down, then we're not going to help anybody.
All right.
I think we should. Yeah.
Where's the incident come out?
Let's just. Yeah. Okay. Let's just wait right here. Let's just station up right here. Okay.
All right, Doc.
Why don't we set up? Can you hang IVs from this pole here?
Okay.
Okay.
Where'd you get go up there, buddy?
We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there. Just gonna wait here until they bring some people out. I was hooked up with some firemen with some first aid stuff.
What do we got?
You know what?
Anything?
Why don't we just set this up as a little mobile hospital unit right here, okay?
Battalion against all units that are available. We'll have a new command post on Murray Street and West Street. Any units available, report it when you're all up to
Any suggestions? Should we set up here for medical work? Think this is safe enough here?
Those pictures shot by Dr. Mark Heath. We don't know much about Dr. Heath, but we, I think, can fairly say that he had extraordinary presence of mind as he continued not only shooting those pictures, but also offering assistance where he could. At one point, he hid behind a car, tried to get into the car to protect himself from both the debris and the smoke that was building around him. The car was locked. He tried to break in, couldn't, and then hid his face in a medical bag, his medical bag. All the while he kept shooting. A couple of things that you might have wondered about. A couple of sounds. There was a chirping sound that you heard at various points in the tape. That is the sound of the locator devices that firemen and women wear so that if they are lost in a fire, their colleagues, their brother and sister firefighters can get to them. And there was also a kind, what sounded to us at least, like a kind of whistling sound. That's the sound of respirators that the firemen, the emergency service personnel, and the rest were using and offering to people who needed it. Our colleagues at CNN-FN are reporting now that the stock exchanges, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, all of course closed today, will remain closed through Wednesday. So the stock markets, the financial markets in the country, and yet again, we cannot recall anything like that ever occurring. Perhaps it has, and we don't remember it, but we don't remember it. The stock markets, all of them, stay closed through Wednesday. Air travel shut down in the United States until at least noon tomorrow, and certainly no guarantee it'll open after that. That affects on an average about 1.5 million people every single day, 40 to 50,000 flights, all of them grounded. There were about 50,000, there were about 50 planes in the air after the FAA essentially locked down airports in the country. All of those planes made it safely to destinations. We don't know they made it to the destinations they were headed for, but they were all able to land safely. CNN's Joey Chin in Atlanta. Joey?
Aaron, we're following and watching these extraordinary pictures as they still come in as we continue to watch all the events. We want to bring our viewers back to where all of this started today, and we have additional pictures to give you some additional perspective to the story we are telling you this afternoon. First up, we go back to 8:48 this morning, that is Eastern. The crash of the first hijacked airliner hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan in New York. You see the gaping hole and you see the black smoke that billowed from the tower. Now this was actually, you're looking at the picture of the second airline that crashed into the second tower, the South Tower as well. Now we want to move you over and show you some exclusive CNN pictures, still pictures of the second crash as it happened. You see the plane bearing in on the South Tower of the Trade Center. This is United Airlines Flight 175. It was a Boeing 767 scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles, 65 people on board, and you see what happened, just sheared right into the South Tower. Horrible crash, massive burst of flames. This crash occurred at 4 minutes after 9 o'clock this morning. Again, that's New York time. Now move ahead to 10:30, 10:29 actually. The North Tower had collapsed already. This is the South Tower. You can see collapsing into the streets of Lower Manhattan, just falling away. We know that as you see it there, it's just falling away, just falling out of the sky, falling into pieces all over Lower Manhattan. And so you can understand the tremendous amount of ash just dumped on Lower Manhattan today. Roughly 50,000 people work in the towers in the center area on a daily basis. And then, of course, there are additional tens of thousands of tourists who would come to the tourists who want to see the tremendous vantage point you would have from the top of the towers. The New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani has told us he does believe that there was a horrendous loss of life there, but he doesn't even want to try to guess how many people have died in New York today. Here now, we want to give you the eyewitness accounts of people who saw some of what happened today.
I heard the sound of a jet. I assumed it was like a Navy jet or something like that, just flying by. Sometimes they'll fly very low near the World Trade Center, not near it. Then I heard a large explosion. I thought it was a sonic boom. And when I heard the explosion, I looked up, and what I saw red, and I saw debris start to fall down. I was so close to the building that I couldn't run away from the building, so I actually had to run towards it. If you know, the World Financial Center has got a rib design, so you actually have a 2x2 space where you can actually sneak into the building and hide. Myself and one other man were there. We had our book bags over our heads. Debris was falling down about the size of this. All portions of the building were falling down. That went on for about 30 or 40 seconds, and that for me was the worst part of this whole experience for me, because I feared for my own life at that time. Well, after that stopped, I walked out myself. I didn't see anybody in the plaza, so nobody was hurt was in the plaza at that point. I walked to my building in the World Financial Center. I'd seen that my colleagues were evacuated the building, were downstairs. Now, on the west side of the World Financial Center, which is right on the Hudson River, there's an outdoor plaza, okay? You can look over the World Financial Center and see the World Trade Center. We were looking back at the building in flames. This is probably 5 after 9, 10 after 9, and we see a second commercial jet flying extremely low actually collide into the South Tower of the building. At that point, we decided just to get out of there. People were just going crazy at that point, evacuating. We started to walk north and ultimately got up to here. During our walk, we saw the South Tower collapse to the ground, decimated, and then later, it was very amazing to see the North Tower standing there by itself after years and years and years of seeing them together. And then all of a sudden, the North Tower just collapsed upon itself and just fell to the ground. It was a cloud of dust that covered all of downtown Manhattan, Battery Park and everything. Phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it.
The eyewitness description of the horrible scene in New York City this morning. And in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that terrible tragedy, there was further chaos down in Washington. 9:45 this morning, an airliner crashing into the Pentagon. The plane, which was American Airlines Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington's Dulles Airport out to Los Angeles. The Boeing 757 hit the Army side of this huge fortress that is the Pentagon, Pentagon, of course, is not just a symbol of the nation's military might, but today is a command center amidst all that has happened. Now, there was a fourth crash, which occurred today in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 was bound from Newark in New Jersey out to San Francisco. There were 45 people on board. Authorities say there were no survivors. In all, there were 4 crashes, 266 passengers and crew, and then, of course, we still have no idea how many people may have died on the ground in the course of all these catastrophes. Joining us now from Dallas, Texas is Jeffrey Beatty. He's a counterterrorism expert who had done work on the first World Trade Center attack. That was back in 1993. As well, he's done some work for the Pentagon. Of course, there will be a lot of trying to read through all of this, Mr. Beatty. Is there something that you have seen in the events of today that you see as perhaps a symbol of what group might be involved, or some other hallmark of terrorism here?
Well, I think it's a little too early to speculate on what group might be involved, Joey. If you remember back to the Oklahoma City bombing, everyone rushed to judgment to think it was perhaps overseas-based terrorism. Now, while all the indicators are going in that direction, it'd probably be prudent to just focus on the rescue efforts today, and also to ask ourselves, you know, how did this happen? And kind of break down the operation and show people that this was a very low-tech but high-concept operation on the part of the terrorists.
Well, describe that for us. What do you mean by that? High concept.
Well, what I mean by that is, you know, Americans tend to rely on high tech. We look to high tech to solve most of our problems. Terrorists don't have high tech at their disposal to the degree that a government such as the United States has. But unfortunately, they have a lot of time. An operation such as this may have been years in the making. We don't know yet how this operation was able to go forward, but let's just, you know, break down the steps. I took a few notes on it. At some point, we all recognized that there was some intelligence failure, that, you know, we've got to do better. We've done good in the past, we've improved our ability to defeat terrorism, but we're not perfect yet, and this is an example of that, to be sure. But then what happened was, the question is, how did these people get some sort of weapon onto an airplane? You know, I'm sure the FAA and the Department of Transportation and all the airports from which these aircraft were launched this morning will be taking a really hard look at that, and I'm sure we'll see some changes in the future.
Not an airplane, Mr. Beatty. I mean, 4 aircraft. That's an awful lot in different locations.
Exactly. This is a highly sophisticated approach, you know, but it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen foreign groups destroy 2 embassies within moments of each other a couple of years ago on the continent of Africa. So we know that our opponent is capable of this type of operation, and he demonstrated it today on our homeland. The interesting thing here, Joey, you didn't need to bring across hundreds of pounds of explosives across a border someplace to commandeer an airplane. Why did they choose these airplanes? They picked these wide-body airplanes. The fact that the World Trade Center was prepared to sustain a hit from a 707 was not a well-kept secret. They picked airplanes that were bigger than that. Also, they picked airplanes that took off from the East Coast, headed to the West Coast, that were big airplanes full of fuel. They weren't interested in killing people on the airplanes. The airplane themselves became the bomb. And so they didn't need to bring explosives into the country. We don't know yet whether it was knives or handguns or whatever. But the next question in the step as we break down the operational acts in this attack is, how did these people get weapons onto the aircraft? And then from there, to continue it, the question is asked, what about a cockpit incursion? How is it that they were able to get into the cockpits of the aircraft, take over the controls, and as we know and have heard in the past that there are transponder codes that pilots can send if an aircraft is hijacked. From what I understand, we didn't get some of that yet, so we have to assume that the cockpits were burst into rather quickly. And I heard Judy Woodruff and others earlier infer, and I join them in drawing the same inference, that it's highly doubtful that the pilots of these aircraft, the United Airlines pilots and the American Airlines pilots, were at the controls of these aircraft when they impacted their targets. So we have got to assume and infer that people capable of flying the aircraft, and remember these aircraft are on duty all over the world, these perpetrators no doubt rehearsed this operation, rehearsed breaking into the cockpit and other locations, that they were probably piloted to the target by people capable of flying a military or a jet aircraft.
Well, do you think, I mean, I have to interrupt you to ask, do you think that perhaps in looking at the possibility of terror threats, I mean, certainly terror threats have come to this country in the past, and I'm wondering if you think perhaps we were thinking too high concept. We thought of something more elaborate and perhaps intelligence should have been focused on this kind of low-tech approach. I suppose hindsight is 2020, but
I think there's a lot of good in what you're pointing out, Joey. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we cannot just focus all our energies on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, etc. We've all been talking about that, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that in recent years. But this didn't use any weapon of mass destruction, and I'm afraid that the casualty tally could approach 5 figures. And that means that we've got to beat these people, not only high tech, but we've got to be high concept. It means we've got to work harder in planning than we have up to this point. And I know that we will. And if I could say a word about the people at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, we've had the privilege in my company to work to support both organizations. We've trained every security officer at both locations. They knew what they were up against. They knew that they were icons, American icons, that were likely to be targeted. Excuse me, it's been an emotional day, plus it's a little hot out here. Likely to be targeted. And they did their best. But they were only one part of a system, as we've just outlined. You know, Doug Karpiloff, the Director of Life Safety and Security for the World Trade Center, is probably one of the premier security people in our country. Doug was always afraid of a scenario where there was a mass casualty incident at the World Trade Center and hundreds of emergency vehicles would rush to the scene. They don't have the ability to check all those vehicles to make sure that they don't pose a threat. So we're yet to determine, we've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Mr. Beatty, we appreciate all of your insight. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you. There are still further developments on this story. Jeffrey Beatty's company is involved in counterterrorism information, and he joined us this afternoon from Dallas. Now let's go back to New York for the latest information there, and Aaron Brown.
Joey, thank you. A couple of things. The president is en route back to Washington, we are now told. The president had started his day in Sarasota, Florida, then went to Shreveport, a military base outside Shreveport, then went to Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command is located, and now he is making his way back to Washington, and we are told the president will address the nation at some point tonight. We do not know at what time, but of course, when it happens, we will carry that live as well. We're also getting reports that a second building in the complex of the Trade Center, and again, you have the 2 towers, but then you have a number of support buildings around it, that another of those buildings, we reported a bit ago on Building 7, we now report that there are problems in Building 5, and that may be collapsing as well, but at least there is fire there. There are enormous logistical problems. We just looked down what is 8th Avenue behind us here, which is normally, at this time of the day, packed with cars. This is rush hour, people trying to get out of the city. It is empty, and the city, in at least this part of the city, Manhattan, is shut down, which means that thousands of people who are trying to get home, trying to get to the suburbs, trying to get to Long Island, trying to get to New Jersey particularly, that's where those trains, what are called the PATH trains, come into New Jersey, from New Jersey rather, at the Trade Center. All of them stranded here. CNN's Richard Roth is down on the streets of New York and is talking to some of the people who I suspect are wondering when they will get home. Richard?
People that you would have seen in locations you were just examining, many thousands are here right now on the west side of Manhattan trying to escape from New York. New York City is sending them to ferries that are taking them to New Jersey. New York City bridges, we're told, are open for pedestrians. The tunnels for trains to take the thousands here were closed. Many of these people stunned, shocked, silence. I mean, you've never heard so many New Yorkers so quiet in your life. And many of them just have to look over their shoulders to see what they escaped as these 2 towers were leveled. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani called it one of the most heinous acts in United States history. He says he fears that the death toll may be more than New York can bear. He asked all New Yorkers to say a prayer. He said a rescue effort was beginning, but as we were told by one official with the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, there is so much jet fuel, furniture, paper, everything still going on up in smoke. He didn't want to send in his people to begin any type of detailed rescue effort. There are reports of some people alive, many dead down there, scores, hundreds of emergency vehicles with their sirens have been roaring down Manhattan's west side here to the scene, carrying federal security people, all kinds. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said that there are more than 1,000 people taken to what's known as Liberty State Park, the walking wounded, he called them, several hundred, 600 or so in New York City hospitals. And the mayor said that there are 170 hospitals that are up and running, and other buildings are helping out for support. U.S. jet fighters overhead, circling occasionally, people craning their necks, looking up in the sky. Everybody's got a memory, everybody's got a story here. I personally saw Trade Tower #1, where CNN's New York bureau used to be in the lobby 17, 18 years ago, come tumbling down, and I was part of a stampede as people just raced for their lives as the smoke came closer and closer to all of us. That was after Tower #2 had gone down. You couldn't even see what was left of it, if anything was standing, due to all of the smoke. Aaron.
Richard, just help orient me for a second. Tell me where you are in the city right now as you talk to us.
We're on approximately 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson River is just behind our camera position here, and it is an orderly departure here. I mean, you can see for yourself. People are just, they left work early, they were ordered out, the city is on high alert, no flights, and people are headed to New Jersey. Many of them would be at the ferry at this time on a normal day. This is certainly not a very normal day in New York City.
It certainly is not, Richard. Thank you. It is, I don't know if remarkable is the right word, but it's worth noting again that in every picture that we have seen from the scene, the people who had just experienced the most horrendous imaginable thing were remarkably orderly and calm as they left the area. I don't want to suggest for a second that there wasn't any panic, that there wasn't any screaming. These are human beings, and human beings behave in a variety of ways. But every picture we have seen, New Yorkers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out. And they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock as they try and figure out what has happened to their city, what has happened to their lives, and perhaps most importantly, what has happened to their friends and their co-workers who may not have gotten out of those buildings today. One of the problems that the city is faced with is, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
We'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove police station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342. 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well. But right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio, and among others, I'm joined by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former Army General Haig, you were, of course, Secretary of State during the Ronald Reagan administration. And Mr. Secretary, you were in that post at a time of a national emergency, the assassination attempt on the life of President Reagan. And what I want to specifically ask you about is, what is it like for the people on the inside, the heartbeat of government, when something horrific like this happens? Of course, this is a very different situation, but what is it like when you have to react to something?
Well, I think most people wait and look for direction. And so it's very important that they have it. If they don't, they sometimes sit in shocked inaction. And so you have to have that. And that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard from President Bush now at 3 different intervals today, when he was still in Florida, when he moved on to Louisiana, and then a statement when he was in Nebraska. Now we know he's back to Washington. Now let me ask you, he's coming back to the Washington area. We don't know where he's going to go. Vice President Cheney at an undisclosed location. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, at an undisclosed location. I'm not asking you to tell us where they are, but what would it be like in one of these locations where they were essentially kept away and kept safe?
Well, all of these installations have been established for precisely this reason. And that means that they're armed with communications, with living facilities, and that's the situation. Now, they don't exercise them all as regularly as I suppose we used to during the nuclear era, but they still exercise them, and they're very, very efficient facilities.
You're saying they don't exercise, presumably because it's felt that the threat isn't as serious in the post-Cold War world?
Well, it's, you know, government is tough, and people are always responding to the crisis of the moment. Usually it's in the first headlines in the daily press. So many times they don't get to go to these relocation sites as often as we'd like, and I used to have to push that when I was in the National Security Council.
The exercises where you would practice what you would do in an emergency. But once they're at the site, I mean, are we talking about very spare surroundings, bare walls, canned goods for food?
No.
I mean, what are we talking about?
It varies. It varies. Of course, there's an airborne facility. We all know that there is an airborne facility for the president, and that's Andrews Air Force Base. There are other facilities, some very, very close and some more distant, which were anticipated might be required in a nuclear attack.
What about the lines of communication? You mentioned that. That was the first point you made, that once they're at these locations, there has to be communications. How up to date is all that?
Well, it's kept pretty well up to date. I know, for example, the day President Reagan was shot, it was very clear to me that that command post, that command and control center, had to be in the west basement of the White House or in one of these alternate emergency facilities, because they were equipped to do precisely that. Now, since that time, we've improved the State Department communication facilities, and the Pentagon, of course, is very well equipped in that regard. So there are 3 locations that you could run a crisis from that are known, but there are others.
General Haig, what do you say to those Americans watching this horrific set of circumstances unfold on television before them and wondering, is America safe? Is America safe? Do I feel safe getting on an airplane and flying somewhere? Am I safe to go into a tall building in Manhattan, to walk into a federal building in Washington, D.C., anywhere, whether it's touring the White House or the Capitol? I mean, what has today done to our sense of safety?
Yeah, the answer to your question, Judy, is obviously whatever we've done heretofore has not been adequate from the standpoint of your question. And that's been a product of a number of things. It's what I call the modern day rationalization of conflict situations, and what I call the development of moral equivalence between the terrorist, who's the perpetrator of the illegal act, where innocent civilians, non-combatants, women, children, everyone are involved, and the defenders against those attacks are equated morally because of some perception of the lack of social justice on one side or the other. And, you know, we're very great, we're moralists here in this country, and we do that. The simple facts are that national leadership has to establish that terrorism is an illegal act of such magnitude now that it overwhelms the issues of social justice, which cause us to quibble and restrain us at a time when a crime of this nature has been executed.
You're saying even over individual liberties in some instances?
Well, sometimes yes, and that's an unfortunate statement as an advocate of those very liberties. But yes, sometimes.
Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Army General Alexander Haig, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.
We appreciate it. And we just heard General Haig talking about terrorism and how much greater a presence it is in our lives than we had expected. We're told that tomorrow the Congress will convene at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're told that they plan to pass a resolution or resolutions condemning terrorism and then immediately adjourn. You're looking at a live picture of the United States Capitol, the flag flying at half staff there. Now that is the White House. That's next to the Executive Office building, but the other picture we saw was a flag flying at half staff near the United States Capitol building. Now back to Joey Chen in Atlanta.
Judy, thanks very much. Joined here on this set by Miles O'Brien, who is our resident pilot and certainly has quite a bit of understanding about the wheres and why-fors and what significance they might have in putting together what happened. Miles has some additional information now, and that's really important to understanding who might have done this and why.
Well, this is sort of our first clue as to what's going on. Obviously, more information will come out as the air traffic control tapes and hopefully the cockpit voice recordings come out. But just take a look at this. This is actual archival information from the radar tracks from the FAA ground centers. And these are the two planes which ultimately ended up at the World Trade Centers, the two towers. Both of them left Boston within 15 minutes of each other. Both were headed to Los Angeles, perhaps no coincidence, heavily laden with fuel. Both of them made extreme and noticeable deviations and were heading in the wrong direction for 30, perhaps 40 minutes, thus clearly giving air traffic controllers quite a bit of attention. There must have been some communication back and forth. It's unclear now.
This is certainly something the air traffic control folks would have seen. They would have seen these things
Clearly.
coming up close.
And the fact that two planes were doing this must have seemed odd. We don't know what the conversations were, but suffice to say that would be odd. Now take a look at this flight. This is United 93. This took off from Dulles Airport, was headed for San Francisco. Once again, a coast-to-coast flight, heavily laden with fuel, flew on out from Newark to about Cleveland, then took its dogleg, was headed pretty much to the D.C. area, and then disappeared off the radar screens right here outside of the Pittsburgh area, a place called Shanksville. We don't know what happened there. What's kind of odd about this one, Joey, is that at some point after flying past Pittsburgh, the pilot apparently radioed and changed his destination to DCA, which is Ronald Reagan National Airport. Unclear what that means. Now let me just kind of put this all onto one graphic, if you will. If we can put up that graphic, and I'll use the telestrator to show you exactly what's going on. All right, here are the important cities. First of all, let's take a look at 8 a.m. and see what happens at 8 a.m. And that was the first departure. Okay, this is the flight, American Airlines Flight 11, was headed out this way to Los Angeles, 81 passengers, 11 crew member. Now, 8:15. United Flight 175 heads out a little different route across, also headed for Los Angeles. That was at 8:15. 8:21 a.m., Dulles Airport is your location, and that is American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, 58 passengers and crew. It headed off onto Los Angeles. We don't have a radar track on this, so I'm doing a little bit of speculation there. Finally, United Airlines Flight 93 at 8:43 as it departs Newark Airport and begins its trip all the way over to Cleveland. Now, let's get the impact times here. 8:45, the flight, American Airlines Flight 11, impacts in New York at the World Trade Center. 9:03, the United Flight 175 impacts at the World Trade Center. 9:45 a.m., and of course all these times are Eastern times, the flight, American Airlines flight that was headed from Dulles to Dulles to Los Angeles, hits at the excuse me, I was drawing, I should have been drawing that to New York. I was drawing it to Washington. Hits at the Pentagon, my apologies on that. And then finally, United Air Flight 93 ends up in outside of Pittsburgh. That made a bit of a hash there, but that gives you a sense of how well coordinated this was and how sophisticated an operation this was. A couple of points to remember. The fact that if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767, identical cockpits, so if you were training somebody to fly that aircraft, they're more or less interchangeable. But the point that is worth mentioning here is you had 4 large airliners on transcontinental flights with extreme deviations. The air traffic control system clearly was upset by this. I'm very curious to hear what they have to say about the radio transmissions and whether at some point the big picture was ever analyzed. It's done by individual centers. Maybe the big picture wasn't analyzed.
Miles O'Brien, our correspondent, thanks very much for your insight into all this. Now we return to Aaron Brown up in New York. Aaron.
Joey, Miles, thank you. That is a great point. You do wonder if air traffic controllers were ever able to put the pieces together, and if they were, what they must have thought, what went through their minds this morning when they realized that they had not one anomaly, but that they had several going on at the same time, all one heading to Washington and 2 heading here in New York. CNN's Tim O'Brien has been working the phones, as all of us have been throughout the day, and he joins us from Washington with an extraordinary piece of information on the Pentagon crash. Tim, are you there?
I am. Our understanding is that Barbara Olson was on the plane, a frequent commentator on CNN and the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson. She called her husband twice during the hijacking to tell him the plane had been hijacked, and they lost contact once, and she called back. After the first call, Olson called the command center at the Justice Department to inform them of this hijacking, and they said they knew nothing about it but would track it down. Barbara Olson told Ted the following story, that all the passengers were herded to the back of the plane, including the flight personnel, including the pilot. And the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. You would think if there were a machine gun or any other kind of gun that she would have mentioned that. But the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. I asked Ted if she made any reference to nationality of the hijackers or any suspicions about the motive, and he said she made no reference to that at all. They didn't have a whole lot of time to talk. She said to Ted, "What do I tell the pilot to do?" Somewhat typical of Barbara, a take-charge kind of person. But there was nothing they could do, and they're all trapped in the back of the plane.
Did she, or was she able to tell Mr. Olson how many hijackers were on board the plane? Or at least how many she may have seen?
I asked Ted that. He said, no, but she referred to them as more than one. More than one. Yes. Incidentally, she wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. She was booked on a flight yesterday, but today is Ted's birthday, so she wanted to be here this morning to have breakfast with him before she left.
And
that story.
It's a horrible story, and one can only assume that it is one of many horrible stories that we will hear in the hours ahead. It says something about the world we live in, that people, while this was going on, were able to make cell phone calls. We heard earlier today of another call that was made from a plane, that there was some awareness on the ground, perhaps not formal awareness, but some awareness of what was going on, at least on some of those, excuse me, on some of those planes. Mr. Olson must be devastated.
Well, you can imagine. He's surrounded by friends, but this is tough for everybody. It's tough for the country, but it's particularly tough for the loved ones.
It is indeed. Tim, thank you for your efforts.
Sure.
Thank you for your efforts today. We appreciate that. Again, Barbara Olson, one of the 200-plus passengers on 4 different airliners, and we have no reason to believe that any of those people survived the crashes today here in New York, in Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and at the Pentagon in Washington. We still do not have a very good feel, to be perfectly honest, for how many people have died today. We have no particular feel, to be perfectly honest, how many people have been injured. We can only surmise that we are talking in the hundreds, the thousands of people certainly have been injured today. How many of those will survive, we do not yet know. Judy?
And Aaron, this may be another point where we want to say, God bless the souls of those who have lost their lives today or who are dying as we speak in hospitals and in places where they cannot be reached. I think even those out there who may not believe that there is a God, at a time like this, we all reach out for a higher being, and we want to believe that there is someone who can bring us salvation. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, questions today about the whereabouts of some of the top people in government in the United States. We've known the president's been flying around the country. The vice president's been out of sight. The Secretary of Defense, Mr. Rumsfeld, has also been out of sight. What can you tell us about him, and what else is going on there?
A short time ago, he did come out and inspect the damage here at the Pentagon, along with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Richard Myers. We're so far away, though, we could barely see that it was them. It had to be pointed out to me by a Pentagon official who they were. The Secretary of Defense, although initially ran to the scene, apparently, of the tragedy and actually assisted getting some people onto stretchers, was then brought back to the National Military Command Center in the bowels of the Pentagon, a secure war room area where he has been receiving intelligence briefings and informational updates. The Pentagon says that it can account for all of the senior military leadership. None of them were killed in this attack. However, there have been some
Jamie McIntyre, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're going to go to Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon.
Of terror attacks, the worst that had ever been seen. We express our deep regret and send our condolences, wholehearted condolences. We are ready to extend whatever aid and assistance is required. War against terror is an international war, a war of a coalition of the free world against all the terror groups and against whoever believes that can pose a threat to freedom. This is a war between the good and the bad, between humanity and those who are bloodthirsty. The criminal attack today on innocent civilians in the United States is a turning point in war against international terror. Even if the war against terror is long, and even if the terror will try to raise its head again, there won't be any room in the world in which terrorists, their assistants, and those who send them to be able to find a shelter or a refuge. The government of Israel has decided tomorrow, a mourning day, in a show of solidarity with the American people. I would like to send my condolences to the American people, to President George Bush, and to all the citizens of the United States. In this very difficult hour, our hearts are with you.
בערוץ הראשון, האם תוכל לומר לציבור בישראל מהם ההשלכות שיש עליו?
Could you tell the Israeli public what are the impacts of these attacks on the people here? I have already said very clearly that there will only be a statement. There won't be any other statement apart from what I have already said. We have to wait and see what happened. Our stand vis-à-vis terror is very well known, very firm and decisive, and we will act accordingly.
On behalf of the people of Israel, שר החוץ שמעון פרס העביר בשעות האחרונות מסרים לרשות הפלסטינית בהמשך להחלטת המטבחון בעת הזאת עליהם להפסיק באופן מיידי את הטרור במצב הנוכחי ושייטב להם אם יעשו זאת מבחינתם באופן חד צדדי לרשות הפלסטינית. זה המסר ששמעון פרס העביר. עד כאן יעקב.
And against our common values. The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time. The government of Israel has declared a day of mourning tomorrow as we bow our heads and share in the sorrow of the American people. טוב, תודה רבה לכם.
Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon talking briefly with reporters, offering first of all his condolences to Americans, saying whoever believes or saying rather this has been a threat to freedom. He went on to say this is a criminal attack on innocent civilians, and he called it a turning point in the war against international terrorism. He went on to say, he said, even if this war is long, there will be no room for terrorists to find refuge. He also said that tomorrow in Israel will be a day of mourning. Now we want to go back to the Pentagon, to CNN's military affairs correspondent, Jamie McIntyre. You want to pick up where you left off, Jamie, describing the situation there and also what Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld is up to.
Well, Judy, the fires are still burning here in some parts of the Pentagon, as you can see from some of the smoke that's coming up from behind me. There will be a recovery effort that will get underway fairly soon. A lot of heavy equipment has brought in so-called urban rescue units that are usually used in the event of an earthquake, have been brought in from some of the local fire departments in Fairfax and Montgomery County in order to assist in trying to find the bodies of people here. They have not given any casualty figures, but we know that people died in this incident, including, not the least of which is the more than 60 passengers who were on that American Airlines Flight 77 that took off from Dulles Airport this morning. One of the eyewitnesses to this incident was a TV reporter himself who was in traffic and actually saw the plane come in. I talked to him earlier today. His name is Mike Walter of USA Today Live.
I was heading in northbound on 27 in the traffic this morning. It was, a typical rush hour. Had ground to a standstill, and I looked off. I was, looked out my window. I saw this plane, a jet, American Airlines jet, coming, and I thought this doesn't add up. It's really low, and I saw it. It just went. It was like a cruise missile with wings. Went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon. Huge explosion, great ball of fire, and smoke started billowing out, and then it was just chaos on the highway as people either tried to move around the traffic and go down either forward or backwards. We had a lady who was in front of me who was backing up and screaming, "Everybody go back, they've hit the Pentagon." And it's just sheer terror.
What goes through your mind when you see something like that?
I've asked that question of a million people, and the only thing that I just kept uttering it over and over again. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I can't believe this. And I think that's what goes through your mind, is that you just can't believe that something like this could happen. And yet I was sitting there listening on the radio to the accounts of what had happened in New York. I just listened to the president. And you'd think, as a journalist, I'd put two and two together and think, oh my God, but it didn't even occur to me.
And obviously this was an enormous tragedy, but did you witness any of the rescue or any of the victims?
I got to tell you, I got out and walked over, and I saw parts of the plane. The debris was actually on the overpass there, and I watched as this military personnel just came running out with stretchers and tarps and set up a triage unit. And I just couldn't help but feel for these guys. You know, those are their friends and comrades in there, and yet they immediately jumped into action. It was unbelievable to watch. And the toughest thing for me right now is I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and a lot of her friends have parents who work in the Pentagon. And I just talked to her on the phone, and those kids are going through agony tonight. They don't know if they're okay. So it's tough. I mean, this really hits home.
And Judy, there's still a lot of work to be done here. This part of the Pentagon had undergone a major renovation. Some of the people here told me stories about heroic efforts. Others described how some of the new architecture of the renovated Pentagon may have helped save their lives. One Navy officer told me about how he saw the flames rush by his window, which shook, but because they're made of new tempered glass that had been put in to increase security, they did not break. The work will continue throughout the night. Pentagon officials say they do hope to reoccupy the other part of the building that's not affected. It's a huge building. 24,000 people work here, but it may be a number of days before anybody's able to go back to work. Judy?
All right, Jamie McIntyre reporting from the Pentagon. And Jamie, your interview reminding us that first and foremost, this is a horrific human tragedy. Families with hearts broken in New York, in Washington, and all across this nation. Just a quick word on what we've been learning. We do expect tonight President George Bush will speak to the nation in a televised address. We don't have much more information than that in terms of when. In addition, we are told that the 4 leaders of Congress, the House Speaker Dennis Hastert, the House Democratic leader Richard Gephardt, and over in the Senate side, Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader, and Trent Lott, the Republican leader, all 4 of them will come together at, I'm told, 7:30 on the east front of the Capitol for a news statement, perhaps a news conference. We all know that at times of crisis, the very visceral fights that go on between the political parties in our country fall away. It may only be for a brief period, but this is one of those times when political partisan differences are being put aside to come together to speak to the country. Joining me here in the Washington studio, a familiar name, a familiar face, best-selling author of so many novels, Tom Clancy, mysteries at the heart, Tom Clancy, of the military community, the intelligence community. People in our newsroom have been saying today what's happening is like right out of a Tom Clancy novel, but could you possibly imagine something like this to write about?
No, one of the problems with being a writer of fiction is that you can't keep up with all the madmen in the world as much as you try. And I frankly would have thought that this was not a credible threat to have 4 separate people decide to commit suicide in the same way on the same morning.
Why not?
Because ending your own life is not something the average person does. You know, everybody's assuming these are Islamic terrorists. Well, if so, they've defiled their own religion. You know, Islam does not permit suicide. It says you go to hell if you do something like this.
But we see suicide bombings in the Middle East and in Israel. And
Judy, we saw people in Northern Ireland, Catholics acting like savages and Protestants acting like savages. So anyhow, we have people who call themselves Muslims acting like savages. It happens. It's not because of their religion. It's because they're fools.
What does this say now? I mean, you've done a lot of reporting. I mean, you not only write fiction, you do a lot of reporting from inside the intelligence community, inside the military community. What does this say about how prepared we are as a country?
Well, people always ask that kind of a question when things go wrong, but you don't ask the question when things go right, and the reason is you can't tell when things go right in that business. Well, one of the things I've been saying for a lot of years is that we need to upgrade the human capability, human intelligence capabilities in CIA and the rest of our intelligence community, because you can do a lot with satellites, you can do a lot with eavesdropping techniques, but you can't find out what's in a person's mind except by talking to that person. And so the agency needs to increase its human intelligence capability. The CIA has about 20,000 employees, less than 1,000 of whom are actually field intelligence officers. That number should be at least doubled. But you know, America as a nation doesn't love our intelligence community. And certainly the news media does not love our intelligence community.
I'm going to interrupt you, Tom Clancy. I'm told Aaron Brown in New York has a development. Aaron?
Well, Judy, just in the last few seconds, another building, we will speculate carefully here that there was building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers has collapsed. Those of you who have been with us for a while, you can see indeed that the smoke color has changed has gotten much lighter. So we believe that yet another building, this would be the third building, has collapsed, likely building number 7, although we also heard that there were problems at building number 5, and it's possible that one went down too. But again, another building in the Trade Center complex appears now to have caved in after these attacks. Judy?
Aaron, we're looking at these pictures, Tom Clancy and I, as we sit here in the Washington studio, and as I come back to Tom Clancy, I want to read just a portion of a statement issued by Secretary of State Powell, Colin Powell, calling these attacks a terrible tragedy befallen not just my nation, but all the nations of this region, all the nations of the world, all those who believe in democracy. Tom Clancy, you were saying, sure, we can ask these questions about failed security, failed intelligence when things go wrong, but we have every right to ask these questions, don't we?
Well, no, the First Amendment, you have a right to say anything you want, but as a practical matter, one of the things we have to do, if you want to prevent things like this from happening, you build up your defenses. And your first line of defense against terrorism is an intelligence gathering capability. Now, when was the last time CNN or the news media in general said, gee, we ought to put more money into the human intelligence capabilities of the CIA? Answer, you never do it. Never.
Well, we wouldn't take a side on something like that. Anyway, in terms of what do you fund and...
Yeah, but you always take a side on saying they failed. Why not help them succeed once in a while?
Are you saying that they are significantly underfunded in that area? And not just the CIA, but the FBI?
Human intelligence is de-emphasized. The FBI's job is...
Spying is what we're talking about
Yeah,
here.
that's what intelligence officers do, is they spy. And the CIA has 20,000 employees, about 800 of whom are actually spooks. Of them, maybe as many as 2/3 actually get outside and do spook operations.
And we know that...
And we need to do better than that. We need to do more than that. You gather information of this type by putting people out on the street, the same way cops gather information from informants. This isn't rocket science. It's just a matter of hiring the people and letting them do the work.
But I'm going to turn it back over to Aaron, but my question is, how do you know what to believe? We had an Arab journalist in London just today saying, we had this information a few weeks ago, it was coming, we didn't know whether to believe it. Now back to Aaron in New York.
Thank you. We've talked a number of times today about the fact that it is simply too dangerous for officials to get in and around these buildings. It's so very, very dangerous, and the proof of that just a few moments ago when another building in the complex that is the World Trade Center, or was the World Trade Center, collapsed. Maureen, we can show you what that looked like. These are taped pictures taken literally just a few moments ago when that building went down. We are seeing them for the first time. This is, correct me in the booth, but I believe that was in fact a piece of tape that we got just a bit ago of the second plane hitting the South Tower of the Trade Center just a little bit after 9 o'clock this morning. Again, a third building at the Trade Center has collapsed within the last 3 or 4 minutes. Building number 7, this is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities. It looks small, I guess, when you look at what was the 100+ stories of the World Trade Center, but building number 7, it's 40+ stories, almost 50 stories, collapsing as well. And if we can go back to the tape and see it one more time, and I'll look at it with you. Again, this occurred just in the last several moments around the Trade Center building. Building number 7, 47 stories. Maureen Madden, CNN producer, is in the area. Maureen, what can you tell us? What did you see?
Well, about 2 minutes ago, we had to see 7 World Trade Center go down, which holds the Office of Emergency Management for the City of New York on the 23rd floor there. When we heard from the fire department of NYPD, is that the whole south part of the building was engulfed in flames at one point, and it was a matter of time to collapse. They're just waiting for it to collapse, which we've been waiting for about a half hour. When it went down, it was quick, it was quiet, and we saw a lot of smoke come up. And now the smoke has pretty much gone off to the side, going towards the east side of Manhattan.
So unlike the collapse of the first of the towers way back this morning, around 10 or so this morning, and then the second tower, which collapsed shortly thereafter, at least where building number 7 is concerned, a building that, among other things, housed the emergency response team of the city of New York, at least they had some warning. They had signs that this might happen, and they were able to get as many people away from the area. And the people in the area, of course, are firefighters, EMS personnel, and literally thousands of police officers who have cordoned off the area.
Correct. About 5 minutes ago.
For those of you who have been with us throughout the day, we have shown you a number of times a piece of video, pictures of a plane coming into the building. We have now another piece of video that will show the same thing, different angle. And if we can roll that and take a look now, this again was shortly after the first. Wow, oh my gosh. I wonder, this comes to us from PAX TV. I wonder, guys, if we can re-cue that in a moment and show that again. You see the fire coming out of the first building there, the plane on the lower left side of your screen. And it looks to me, and I'll confess I don't have the greatest monitor here, but you could almost see the nose of that plane coming through the other side of the building. That may have been an illusion as we looked at it here, but that's how it looked to us. As the flames, these are fully loaded planes, fully loaded with jet fuel. They were headed from the East Coast to the West Coast, so they had an enormous amount of jet fuel. Jeffrey Beatty, a security consultant, said to us a little bit ago, this was low-tech, high-concept. The plane was the bomb, and you just saw the bomb go off. That was around 10 o'clock this morning. That was around 9 o'clock this morning, about 9:08 this morning. Ben Wiedemann, who normally reports for us, I'm sorry, we'll get to that. Let's go back to Washington and CNN's Judy Woodruff. Judy?
Aaron, again, pictures that have everyone here riveted. We're told, I don't know whether we have this picture right now available to show our viewers, but I'm told that just a short time ago, driving up Massachusetts Avenue, which is one of the main thoroughfares here in the nation's capital, goes all the way from the Capitol out to Northwest Washington, beyond the Naval Observatory where the Vice President lives, and beyond on out into the Maryland suburbs. There was observed a convoy of military vehicles, Humvees, military vehicles, driving up slowly, patrolling, appearing to patrol the area, going out away from the Capitol toward northwest, toward Maryland. Now, perhaps this is just a patrolling effort, but the sight of it has to be something to cause comment, because normally at this hour in Washington you would see an enormous amount of just rush hour traffic, but today is not like any other day. Now to our own senior White House correspondent, John King, who's just about a block and a half from the White House on top of an office building up above the 10th floor there. John?
Judy, a few quick bits of information. As we have been reporting, the President is on his way back to Washington, and we can now say definitively that when he arrives in Washington, he will address the American people tonight. I am told by sources plans are for an address from the White House. The target time, 9 p.m. That could be moved up a little, but 8 or 9 p.m. we are now told is the target time. But for now, the administration will not confirm that the address will be broadcast from the White House. There have been security concerns throughout the day. We see now on the grounds of the White House, which was evacuated hours ago, some bomb-sniffing dogs and other security personnel securing the area around the White House. But we are told by administration officials the President will be back in Washington shortly and will address the American people tonight. And as we reported a bit earlier, congressional leaders who also, as part of the protocol, the emergency evacuation protocol, were taken to secure locations themselves outside of Washington. The bipartisan congressional leadership also making its way back to Washington, and it will deliver statements, the 4 leaders from the steps of the Capitol tonight as well. All of these designed to offer signs of reassurances to the American people that their government is up and running at this time of great tragedy. I want to add one other bit of information. a lot of lawmakers trying to get briefings from Capitol Hill police, from administration officials, from the CIA and the FBI and others. We are told that in those briefings there has been some speculation, and again the law enforcement officials saying this is just speculation at this moment, that that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh may have been heading toward Washington. In those briefings, I'm told by several sources, 3 potential targets were listed. 1, the presidential retreat at Camp David, 2, the White House, and 3, the United States Capitol building. Again, though, lawmakers and other officials being given those briefings told that is speculative, but based on the flight paths and everything else we've seen unfold on this tragic day, that law enforcement officials believe at this moment that the potential targets for that plane, which crashed outside Pittsburgh, were perhaps Camp David, perhaps the White House behind me, or perhaps the United States Capitol. Judy?
John, and we can only imagine the struggle that must have gone on board that aircraft in the cockpit or wherever in order to keep the plane from going where the people who wanted to bring it to Washington, they were obviously prevented from reaching their target. Air travel throughout the United States, domestic air travel, has been shut down today since these terrible incidents in New York City and here in Washington. In fact, there's no air travel until at least noon tomorrow on order of the Federal Aviation Administration. But right now we want to go to one of the airports in the Washington area, that is Dulles International. This is the site of where the American Airlines flight 77 that left this morning on its way to Los Angeles and ended up plowing into the Pentagon a very short time later. CNN's Eileen O'Connor is there at Dulles. Eileen?
Well, there has been some activity here, Judy. The FBI has arrived, and they have been seen going in and out of the building. They brought some equipment in to check through the building. We do know from airport personnel and the airport authority that both National and Dulles are shut down till 11 o'clock at least tomorrow morning, but also that they've immediately implemented an emergency drill procedure. And that means that they called in all of their police, and they have their own police force and their own fire personnel, and they also have all of their operational staff here at the airport. They are securing the airport. You can see actually behind me, they have actually erected barricades, concrete barricades, with some of these forklifts. Have been operating over the last hour, erecting these barricades. Also, there's barricades right now in the entrances to the airport to prevent anyone from coming back here. As you also said, United and American Airlines, obviously they are the ones that lost flights. They have been issuing statements saying that they are trying to help the families, both of these airlines issuing statements. They've also said that they have accounted for all of their other flights and that they are all safely on the ground. They want to make sure people know that. And they also say that they will do everything they can to make sure that their customers, the people who were traveling, are comfortable until they can fly on to their destinations. Judy?
And Eileen, any other people around there? I mean, we see you, obviously, and we see a few other people, but presumably not much other activity there at all.
No, and they have actually tried to stage some of the, obviously there are relatives, concerned relatives from the American flight that took off from this morning, and we are being told by airport authorities that they are trying to send those relatives over to a nearby hotel and to try to give them information. Both airlines have issued phone numbers for for people to find out about loved ones. One of those airlines is United. Their number is 800-932-8555. But they are saying that people should stay away from the airports. These airports are shut. Again, they're under emergency procedures. And also, you know, Judy, for here, an investigation is taking place. The FBI is already here. They've had sniffer dogs around the airport. They want to see how the security was breached. We are also told that the tarmac has been secure, that the airplanes that are currently on the ground were very quickly secured after it was decided to shut these airports down. Judy?
Eileen, just reiterating, there were 8 cities in the United States involved with these aircraft that plowed into the Trade Center building complex, into the Pentagon, and then into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, south of Pittsburgh. 2 planes took off from Boston, 1 from Newark, 1 from Dulles near Washington, where you are. 3 of those flights were headed for Los Angeles, 1 for San Francisco. Of course, none of those flights reached their intended destination. Now back to Aaron in New York.
Judy, thank you. It is, I know for many of you around the country, you are making your way home. You have not necessarily been with us all day long. Life has gone on, I suppose, with TVs on in most offices, but life has gone on. I just wonder if we can take a shot of the building behind me, the World Trade Center building, and just take a moment to try and absorb, not with the facts, not with the pieces of information, but just look at that scene and think about what happened today. There were 50,000 or so people who came to work on a beautiful late summer morning here in New York, in those two towers that are now gone. These are people with families, with children, people who had offices and have them no more. People whose lives are forever changed. And it happened in a space of very few minutes. 8:48 this morning it began. A few minutes later, at about 9:08, a second plane zoomed towards the unhit tower, the second tower. You see it in the lower part of your screen. And it just slices that tower in half. If we can re-rack it and show it again so you'll know where to look, you'll see the plane first in the lower left side of the screen coming at it, and there it goes. And what must it have been like in those buildings and on these hijacked airliners? We heard earlier that Barbara Olson, a frequent commentator here, was on the flight that was going to Washington, or had been hijacked to Washington. She called her husband and said that the hijacking was underway. She said that from what she could tell, the hijackers, and she didn't indicate how many, except there was more than one, were armed with just knives and cardboard cutters, that they had herded all the people on board this flight to the back of the plane, including the pilot. And she asked her husband, the Solicitor General, Ted Olson, who many of you will recall argued the post-election case before the Supreme Court, said to her husband, "What do I do?" And shortly after that, that plane with Ms. Olson and many more crashed at the Pentagon. General Wesley Clark joins us from Little Rock. General Clark has been with us a number of times today. General, I wonder if you will weigh in for a second on this debate or this discussion that has been going on for most of the afternoon here, which is, have we misapplied in some ways intelligence resources, that we have become so infatuated with what we can do with machines and high tech that we have inappropriately, I guess, spent less money, less time, less effort on the down and dirty human intelligence?
Well, that's certainly a question that everyone is going to be asking, and it will be asked in official channels, and it will be asked to those who are best in a position to give that answer. My experience with it has been that I've heard this charge now for some 25 years in the intelligence business, and we have put emphasis into not only technical intelligence but human intelligence. But you know, it's very hard to get the kind of specific intelligence that would prevent something like this. Many of these people are members of a family. They come from a specific village, perhaps. Their background is known and vetted. They're carefully controlled. Their movements and communications are monitored. And it's difficult, no doubt, for any intelligence organization, no matter how well it's resourced and how courageous its members, to penetrate an organization like that and give us information. Intelligence is always characterized by a failure to know what you don't know. And I'm sure that we'll make improvements. There are always more things that can be done in the aftermath of something like this. But if there's one single message that comes through to me here, and I think will come through to many others, it's that it's not enough simply to put up the best defenses against terrorism, but that more active measures are no doubt called for, particularly in this case.
When you say more active measures, you're talking about proactive?
That's right. Preemptive measures. We've known a number of these groups have, for a long time, said they declared war on the United States. And we have dealt with them, we've fenced with them, we've cooperated with other governments against them, we've chased individuals, we've hauled some into court. But I think that not only do we have to ask ourselves, could we have learned more in this specific case, we have to also ask ourselves, could we have done more if we've been willing to take greater risks, if we've been willing to take more extraordinary measures earlier, to take some of these groups and these individuals at their word that they had declared war on us and they deserved to be taken seriously and they merited some preemptive action.
And just perhaps stating the obvious, sir, when you talk about preemptive action, first of all, you got to be able to find the people you're taking the action against. Do we know where the right people are so that if the country is going after these people, they get the right people?
Well, I think that's always the problem. And there will always be a certain degree of uncertainty, and there'll be a certain degree of concern about this. The best way to handle any international terrorist organization is to arrest its leaders, present the evidence, and have them tried in a court of law. And that certainly is the way anyone would prefer to deal with this. But perhaps in some cases it's not possible to do that, or it's not possible to do that quick enough. We'll have to ask those questions in the aftermath. It's not simply about intelligence, it's also about acting on intelligence.
I mean, ultimately, sir, this is not simply a military or an intelligence question. This is a core political question. It really has to do with how we see ourselves in a country, whether we are willing to take the risks that some innocents may perish because of what we as a country do, and that's a political question for the country to deal with.
It's a profound political question, and I think it's also a question for the international community, because an event like this is a real cry for alarm and recognition in the international community. A tragedy like this can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And international terrorism is too dangerous and too ambiguous and too difficult for any single nation to handle by itself. We need strong, reliable support from friends and allies around the world, and I'm sure we'll be asking for it. And clearly one of the things that ought to come from this is not only better U.S. intelligence, it's better sharing of information, pooling of information with our partners in all corners of the globe.
General Clark, thanks again for joining us, as you have a number of other times today, and I suspect you will again before the day is out. General Wesley Clark in Little Rock, Arkansas today. Thank you, sir. Judy?
Aaron, we want to tell our viewers, first of all, that we have just been handed a report from CNN reporter Patty Davis that all international flights have now arrived or will be arriving shortly. Those are flights coming into the United States or Canada. Those are flights that presumably had left their destination hours and hours ago, but they have arrived safely, or they are expected to shortly. We'll continue to bring you updates on air travel as we get them. And I've just been told that President Bush will address the nation tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Now, we had been told a little bit earlier the President would be speaking to the American people. We now have confirmed the time is 9 o'clock Eastern, and you can count on the fact, of course, CNN will carry that address. CNN correspondent Jean Meserve has spent the last several hours at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. These are the people who, Jean, are dealing all the time with disasters. Bring us up to date on what's going on there now.
Judy, the National Interagency Emergency Operations Center is up and running here, as it is often at times of disaster. We went up and looked at that a couple of hours ago. There are about 40 people up there. They represent 28 different government agencies and offices, also the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. What they do is try and figure out what local and state officials need to help them deal with a disaster situation, and they have already made some moves today. They have dispatched urban search and rescue task forces. 4 of them have been sent to the Pentagon, 4 are en route to New York City. Another 4 have been activated, 3 of those in California, 1 in Missouri. Last time I was able to speak to an official here, they were trying to figure out how to get them to New York City. Apparently it was going to take a military airlift because, of course, there is no commercial air traffic at this time. Each of those task force consists of 62 people and about 60,000 pounds of equipment. That's medical gear, tools, dogs, food. The idea is they are supposed to be able to be self-sufficient for 72 hours at a stretch. They provide a wide array of services. They will do search and rescue. They can shut off utilities. They can check the structural integrity of buildings. There are a total of 28 of these task forces around the country. We've been told that the other 16 most of them have been put on alert status, but they have not yet been activated and given orders to move. In addition, disaster mortuary affairs teams, 4 of them have been sent to New York City, 3 of them to the Pentagon. 30 people on each of these teams. What they do is help take care of the bodies after they have been extricated from the wreckage. Also, there are disaster medical assistance teams, 4 of them to New York, 3 to the Pentagon, 35 people on each of those teams. Those would be doctors, nurses, and paramedics to help, of course, with the medical situation. I should mention that the director of this agency, Joe Alba, was not in Washington when these events took place. He was out in Montana at a conference of the National Emergency Managers Conference. This is all the state emergency directors from around the country. He, of course, immediately made moves to get back to Washington. We believe he is now on his way here. Judy, back to you.
All right, Jean Meserve telling us about the teams of experienced people who are being deployed from FEMA. That's the nickname for the Federal Emergency Management Agency headquartered here in Washington. But right now, teams of people being sent out, deployed to the sites of these horrific disasters. The New York Twin Towers, World Trade Center, you're still looking at those live pictures on the right part of your screen here in Washington, to the Pentagon, the site of another airplane crash. Joining us now from Charlottesville, Virginia, former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. He was Secretary in the administration of the first President, George Bush. I want to ask you, Secretary Eagleburger, so many people, we've been talking to a lot of people today, but it seems to me that many Americans now are going to want to strike back, to get back as soon as we can and as hard as we can at whoever was behind this. How realistic is that?
Oh boy, that's a very tough question. Well, it won't be quick, I think. It'll take us some time to organize ourselves, try to figure out who was responsible for this. Although I might say, by the way, that's less of a concern to me than it will be to a number of others. We know who most of the terrorists are. We may not know which ones did this, although they have to have been very, very well organized and very well financed. But getting back at it almost is the wrong way to, I think, to put this. So that's what a lot of people will want. What I think we need now to understand is this really is a war with terrorism, and we need to be prepared to act as if we are at war, and that does not necessarily mean that you have to strike back only at those that you know were the perpetrators of this thing.
Well, what does it mean?
We know a lot of terrorists around the world, and we know a lot of governments that have financed and supported terrorism. And you start with Osama bin Laden, I suppose, and you start with the Afghans.
Well, what can you do, Mr.
Well,
Secretary?
what you do, and this is what you do, is you strike at them militarily. I mean, I know this is going to sound awful, but my point is there's only one way to begin to deal with people like this, and that is you have to kill some of them, even if they are not immediately, directly involved in this thing. We do know that the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan has mothered Osama bin Laden for years. They need to be hit. Either they need to be hit, or they need to understand very quickly that they have got to stop supporting terrorism. and then make it evident that they're stopping the terrorism.
So you're not talking about a long, drawn-out investigation as we had with Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, and
I hope
a
not.
long, drawn-out effort to extradite possible suspects.
I hope not. I hope not, because if that's the case, well, you saw what happened with Pan Am 103. I mean, by the time it was all done, first of all, many people had lost all interest in the subject. This is an act of war. When they compare this to Pearl Harbor, I don't think they're wrong in the sense that it's a surprise attack, and I suspect, if we are wise about this, Pearl Harbor brought the American people together and made us recognize we had something we had to deal with. Perhaps this will do the same thing for all of us.
All right, former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger.
Can I make one more point? One more
yes,
point
Mr.
before you
Secretary,
go?
you may.
We need to find out what happened that these planes could be hijacked. That, to me, is the most critical question of all. How was it possible to hijack these aircraft? I thought we had dealt with that problem before. If, in fact, if they had not been hijacked, none of this would have happened.
Well, we did hear just from a fragment of information, Mr. Secretary, reportedly from Barbara Olson, the conservative commentator, the wife of the United States Solicitor General,
Right.
told her husband and others in a phone call these were men who had hijacked. This was the American Airlines flight that left Dulles, that these men, as far as she could tell, only had knives and paper or cardboard cutters on them as weapons. We want to thank Secretary Lawrence Eagleburger for joining us. Joey Chen in Atlanta.
Judy, thanks very much. For our viewers who have just been trying to catch up on all the events that have occurred today, I want to bring you first up to date with the latest information on a full detailed tick-tock of what has happened in the course of this day. Look at the latest from Ben Wiedemann.
8:45 a.m. in New York. Smoke billows from the World Trade Center after a large passenger plane slammed into the North Tower. Initial reports suggested it was an accident. 9:03, another airliner hits the Trade Center's South Tower, an explosion bursting from the building's upper floors.
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
President Bush calls the crashes an apparent terrorist attack. 9:45, another hit. A commercial plane crashes into the Pentagon. 9:51, taking no chances, the Federal Aviation Administration grounds all takeoffs and landings and reroutes incoming international flights to Canada. And the Pentagon soon upgrades its terrorism alert status to Delta, the highest possible level. 10 a.m., back in New York, the Trade Center's South Tower crumbles to the ground. 10:29, the North Tower collapses. These buildings were once the tallest in the world. Lower Manhattan, home to the city's financial district, is shrouded in smoke, dust, and ash. 10:10 a.m., a half hour earlier, United Flight 93, bound from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, crashes into western Pennsylvania. Police there say initial reports suggest there were no survivors. In Washington, the Departments of Justice, State, Treasury, and Defense were among those ordered evacuated, as were the Capitol and the White House. In New York, major businesses and stock exchanges were evacuated. All tunnels and bridges into and out of the city were shut down. The United Nations was evacuated as a precaution. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people are feared hurt or killed in what is clearly the worst ever terrorist attack on the United States. Ben Wiedemann, CNN.
More perspective now. We turn to Brian Jenkins, who is a counterterrorism expert. He joins us from Los Angeles this afternoon. Sir, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit. I mean, it cannot escape our attention that the targets struck were in the very seats of U.S. wealth, of U.S. military power, and indeed very symbolic structures. I wonder if you can give us some indication about what the terrorists, what symbol, what signal they're trying to send here.
I think they are trying to send just that signal, and that is their ability to strike at the heart of American power. The Pentagon being the heart of American military power, the World Trade Center being in Lower Manhattan, the heart of the nation's economic power. Both of these structures, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, in addition being great symbols of these cities, great symbols of America. Their ability to strike those is intended to create alarm and panic throughout the United States.
And in fact, there have been closings of businesses, of schools, of all sorts of things all over the country in the course of this day because of these assaults. I'm wondering if you can give us any of your perspective. Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball to look at these things, but should we regard this as being done at this point? It has been silent for much of the rest of the day since this morning.
One has to be very, very careful in looking at a multiple coordinated attack like this to say exactly when it's over. I mean, it was 31 years ago, almost to the day, that in a single day, 3 airliners were hijacked. One of the hijackings failed, but the other 2 airliners, plus an airliner that was hijacked on the following day, were flown to Desert Airfield in Jordan, where the hijackers, members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, held the hostages for a number of days.
All right, Mr. Jenkins, I'm sorry to have to interrupt you here. We do have some late developments. As you see at the bottom of your screen, there are reports from CNN's Nick Robertson in Kabul, Afghanistan, of explosions there. I want to get some additional information now. CNN's Aaron Brown from his rooftop vantage point in New York. Oh, and actually, this is Nick Robertson now in Kabul. Nick, what can you tell us out there?
Well, Jerry, it's about 2:30 in the morning here in Kabul. We can hear explosions around the perimeter of the city. We're in a position here which gives us a view over the whole city. We just heard an impact perhaps a few miles away. If I listen, you can hear the ripple of explosions around the city. Perhaps we've heard there the sixth explosion. I see gunbursts and starbursts in the air. Tracer fire is coming up out of the city. I hear aircraft flying above the city of Kabul. Perhaps we've heard half a dozen to 10 detonations on the perimeter of the city, some coming from the area close to the airport. I see on the horizon what could be a fire on the horizon, close perhaps to where the airport might be. A flash came up then from the airport. Some ground fire coming up here in Kabul. A lot of flashing reflecting off clouds towards the horizon here. We thought that might have been a thunderstorm before. The detonations we're hearing now much louder than a thunderstorm. Also detonations very similar to those caused by large missiles. I've been in Belgrade and I've been in Baghdad and seen cruise missiles arrive in both those cities. The detonations we're hearing in Kabul right now certainly sound like the detonations of loud missiles that are coming in. We do see tracer fire going up into the air and hear the detonations towards the perimeter of the city, heavy air detonations we can hear now. It's what sounds like a lot of anti-aircraft fire going up, multiple detonations we can hear in the air. I'll try and be quiet for a moment, see if we can pick up some of those sounds coming in from the perimeter of the city, Joey. Very quiet at this particular moment. The city still tracer fire, rockets going up around the airport, tracer fire flying across the city in the direction of the airport. The city at this stage still very well illuminated. The electricity supply is still on in the city, illuminating the city. Detonation coming in from towards the airport. Multiple detonations now going off again towards the perimeter of the city in the direction of the airport. We see one fire on the horizon at this moment. Kabul is surrounded by mountains. The detonations reverberate from those mountains, so it's difficult to get an accurate fix on exactly where the impacts are happening. Certainly, certainly it would appear that the Afghan defense systems have detected a threat in the air. They are launching what appears to be anti-aircraft defense systems at the moment. Certainly I can see that fire that was blazing on the horizon. It was a faint yellow. It's now a bright orange blazing. Several other detonations going off around the city, multiple areas. Rockets appear to be taking off from one end of the airport. I can see that's perhaps located about 8 or 9 miles away from where we stand, Joey.
We want to ask you to please keep your line up to us. We're having difficulty reaching you on another line, but please keep your line up. We can see the pictures coming to us by the video phone. Again, this is very advanced technology that CNN is using, but you will see some of the digital effect. It is not quite as clear as your average television signal, and so to our viewers, we apologize for that. But this is certainly the only video that you're going to get from Kabul, Afghanistan at this point, and you're watching it on CNN. Again, we are hearing from our correspondent, Nick Robertson, who's on the scene in Kabul with his team there, and he has reported the sounds of tracer fire. He has reported the fire burning there in Kabul, the seat of Afghanistan's power and the seat of its Taliban government. Again, we are watching their picture coming to us on the video phone, and it is very hard, of course, to see exactly what you're looking at, but you are looking at Kabul. Again, you see some tracer fire there coming across the scene. Nick Robertson, can you hear us?
We're being told, Joey, I can hear you if you can hear me. Certainly, big detonation there, missiles flying across the city. We're being told from sources in Kandahar, that's the spiritual capital of Afghanistan, 300 miles south of here, that there is no rocket activity like this south of here in Kandahar. Certainly in Kabul, very, very active at this stage. Multiple detonations. It is nighttime here. It is dark. It is difficult to get an accurate fix on exactly what we're seeing and exactly what we're hearing. Certainly the sound, what appears to be the sound of large missiles incoming and landing in the city. Certainly a big fire on the horizon of the city at the moment. And certainly anti-aircraft fire coming up from the city and rockets being launched and flying across the horizon of the city. Rockets perhaps going at the speed of several hundred miles an hour, the sort of speed that one might expect to see cruise missiles traveling across the horizon at, burning with a white glow coming from their tails rather than a yellow glow. The fire on the horizon that we can see from here burning furiously now. Perhaps it would be accurate at this stage to suspect that that was a fuel dump that's been hit by the way that it's burning, flames leaping, and that fuel dump must be perhaps 5 to 8 miles from where I am. Flames leaping up from that fuel dump now leaping up right into the air. It was a low-burning fire before, but it's now really increased in its ferocity, perhaps indicating that it is a fuel dump. Looking across the rest of the city, that fuel dump, perhaps the only big fire we can see at this time. From our vantage point here at the Kabul Intercontinental Hotel that overlooks the whole of the city of Kabul, that is in a basin surrounded by mountains, the whole city is laid out in front of us. The gunfire that was coming up from the city seems to have subsided for now. We're not hearing any more detonations at this moment. And as I say, the fire on the horizon really burning furiously at this time, flames leaping way up in the air this moment. Joey?
Nick, if you can talk to us a little bit about your circumstance. It is 6 o'clock in the evening here in Atlanta. It must be quite late at night there in Kabul.
Indeed, 2:30 in the morning here, Joey. We're eight and a half hours ahead of East Coast time in the United States. And it was about 5 hours ago that the foreign minister of Afghanistan, Ahmed Mutawakil, briefed journalists. I hear more detonations going off now. He said that the Taliban had not taken precautions against the possibility of there being an air attack against Afghanistan. He said because it was not necessary. The Taliban spiritual leader, Mullah Omar, had also made a statement saying that they felt Osama bin Laden wasn't responsible for what had happened in the United States. He said his country was a peaceful country. He wanted it to be at peace, and he wanted peace in other countries around the world. Certainly what we're seeing in Kabul these early hours of this Wednesday morning is very far from peace. Certainly multiple explosions happening in and around the city. There is a front line about 50 miles north of the city where the Taliban are fighting a battle against the Northern Alliance here. We could hear detonations coming from that northern area as well. But on the perimeter of the city, particularly in the direction of the Kabul airport, which is about 5 to 8 miles from where we are, detonations coming from there. I remember standing on this balcony about 4 years ago watching fighter jets bomb that airport as part of Afghanistan's ongoing civil war. The flash at the airport to us hearing the detonation at the hotel is about the same duration. So I am using that as an estimate to gauge that those missiles again are falling in the area of the airport. First, we're seeing the flash, and then we hear the detonation some several seconds afterwards, and they appear to be coming from that airport area, in some cases several miles away from us. There is still a lot of flashing we can see in the air reflected off clouds. That could be thunder and lightning. However, there's a possibility that those reflections are missiles landing elsewhere. The flashes as they explode and reflecting off the clouds. But it's not a good indication. We certainly don't hear any detonations coming from that particular direction at this time. The anti-aircraft fire that we were seeing a little while ago is not coming up from the city. The city, apart from the detonations we were hearing a few minutes ago, appears very, very calm. The visibility here is excellent. We can see all the way across the city. It lies on a plain that's surrounded by the mountains here in Kabul. We have high mountains to the right. These mountains were used by the Mujahideen as vantage points for shelling the city several years ago during the Mujahideen infighting in Kabul. The last 5 years, the Taliban have been in control of this city, have been trying to extend their control over and across Afghanistan. And the foreign minister this evening telling journalists and CNN that he didn't believe that Afghanistan would be attacked. He said if Afghanistan was attacked, then they would call it, the Taliban would call it an act of state-sponsored terrorism. Joey.
All right, that is CNN's Nick Robertson. Again, please keep the line open to us. Nick Robertson there in Kabul, Afghanistan. For our viewers who are watching this with us on the air, again, we're getting this from video phone technology. You're seeing this exclusively on CNN. It is a very new technology, and so you could tell from the audio line it is not as clear as our typical TV feed, and the visuals obviously are not as clear, but you are looking at the city of Kabul in Afghanistan. This is the seat of the Taliban government there, not its spiritual center, but its government center. In any case, you are seeing in just about the last 10 minutes, we have been hearing these reports from CNN correspondent Nick Robertson on the ground in Kabul of an explosion. You see on the right side of your screen about a third of the way over, the flames of fire. They were quite large just a short time ago, seem to have simmered down, but again, we're just not seeing very much of this because it's the video phone. Again, Nick Robertson saying that they had seen tracers going up as well. They have been listening and hearing the possibility of additional explosions elsewhere. They're trying to follow that, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Again, it is 2:30 in the morning in Kabul, and Nick Robertson continues to watch there. Now let's turn to Judy Woodruff for us in Washington. Judy.
Joey, we are in the studio in Washington, but of course riveted to these pictures coming out of Kabul, Afghanistan. With me in the studio watching former United States Defense Secretary William Cohen and Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah. I want to ask both of you about what's going on. Let me begin with you, Secretary Cohen. Is this something that is likely to be the United States retaliating, which is what I think immediately comes to people's minds?
I think we have to be very cautious in coming to that judgment, Judy. What we're looking at now is the United States gathering information and intelligence. Obviously, there are many plans and contingency plans that we have to deal with responding to any potential terrorist threat that might be in the offing again. But I think it's very premature to make any judgment on this. This could be part of the civil war that's been raging on for some time, and so I think we have to wait to get more information.
What do you mean part of a civil war?
Well, there's been a civil war raging in Afghanistan for some time now, and this could be simply the factions still carrying on their fighting in Kabul, rather than any kind of an attack being launched by the United States.
Are you saying, Mr. Cohen, that it's unlikely that the United States would move this quickly? I'm asking that because just a few minutes ago I was interviewing former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, and he said flat out what the United States needs to do is strike against countries like Afghanistan that are harboring terrorists and not wait to find out exactly who was responsible for today's atrocities.
Well, I think we do have to isolate and ostracize those countries like Afghanistan and others who are on the terrorist list who give safe harbor for terrorists. But I think we have to be a little more judicious rather than simply striking out. We have to get more information, and further strikes might be warranted. But at this point, I think we get all the information, then make a very cold, ice-cold decision in terms of what we need to do to protect the American people and make sure that this doesn't happen again. But I think that may be a bit premature at this point.
Senator Hatch, again, we're stressing we have no idea who's behind these attacks in Kabul, the government center of Afghanistan. But if this were the West, if this were the United States, would it be appropriate to retaliate so quickly?
Well, we have some information. You know, about a month ago we had information that they were planning on some big strikes, people who were affiliated or associated with bin Laden. Then just today, we've intercepted some information where some people who are associated with bin Laden basically said that they had hit 2 targets. So it looks to me like there's increasing evidence, even though it's fragmentary and even though it's not positive, that bin Laden is behind all this. And of course, I first warned the nation in 1996 on Meet the Press that we better get hold of bin Laden or he's going to kill Americans.
We're going to bring back our Nick Robertson there on the ground in, or I should say on top of a building there in Kabul. Nick, you're on. Go.
Well, certainly the fire we were watching on the horizon before, I'd made the assumption that it was an oil depot burning because we've certainly seen flames, a dull yellow fire turn into a bright orange fire with flames leaping into the sky. I've been informed by my associates here who work with us in Kabul that it's very likely an ammunition dump that we're looking at. They believe an ammunition dump is located in that area. That, of course, would account for some of the explosions that we've been hearing here as ammunition has detonated and gone off from that location, Judy. Yeah. Certainly it's all quiet here in Kabul right now. Certainly no more explosions are being heard around the city. And we certainly believe what we're looking at now is an ammunition dump, the fire at that dump now dying down, and we're hearing no more detonations coming from that dump. Certainly Kabul is within striking range of some of the long-range missiles that the Northern Alliance has and is capable of launching in this direction. And certainly in the past, the Northern Alliance has launched missiles at Kabul. It is not without the realms of possibility that the Northern Alliance could launch missiles at this time. The Northern Alliance in the last couple of days has gone through the rather traumatic process of an assassination attempt on its key leader, Ahmed Shah Massoud. Still unconfirmed whether that leader is alive or dead, and certainly there's a ferocity within the internal fighting going on in Afghanistan at this time. One certainly cannot rule out that any missiles falling on the city tonight could be coming from that Northern Alliance.
So, Nick Robertson, just to clarify, you're saying it could well be part of an internal, civil war that we see here, and not a result of something coming from the West, NATO, the United States?
From our vantage point this evening, we can certainly report a large number of explosions around the city, what appears to be an ammunition dump on fire, a lot of return fire coming up from positions in Kabul. We cannot say from this position at this time exactly where the missiles are coming from, those causing the detonations in and around the city of Kabul. It is possible it's from the Northern Alliance, and of course there is the other possibility that we've been talking about this evening.
And Nick, is this typical of the kind of fire that you've been seeing back and forth in this war that's been going on in Afghanistan? Is this at all typical?
No, one would definitely have to say it's not typical. The strikes on Kabul have been very infrequent over the last few years, very occasional. The Northern Alliance very aware that it's been blamed in the past of many civilian casualties by launching attacks on Kabul. So there have been very few direct attacks on the city. And indeed, the forces of the Northern Alliance are at such a distance back from the city, only long-range, medium-range missiles capable of going 30, 40, 50 miles are able to reach the city from their positions. And it's certainly not something that's happened in this city, a barrage of this type, a sustained artillery attack or missile attack of this type in recent years even.
All right, Nick Robertson, we want you to stay connected to us. Let's keep this connection alive. But as we're watching these pictures, let's now go back to New York and to Aaron Brown. Aaron.
Judy, thank you. I'm joined here as well by Paula Zahn, and you will hear her voice in just a moment. As we continue to look at these pictures out of Afghanistan, again, I would remind you that the technology here is called a video phone. It is very high-tech and a little bit imperfect, but it is perfect enough so that you can clearly see that fire burning in the distance. What Nick Robertson has described as an ammunition dump, very probably, and you can very clearly see, or we've been very able to see throughout Nick's reporting, the tracer fire coming up, the anti-aircraft fire coming up.
I think we need to make it clear at this point that no group has claimed responsibility for the multiple attacks today, and yet U.S. intelligence officials confirmed with David Enser earlier today that they believe a group connected to Osama bin Laden may have been involved. You have talked about this all day long, and I think you've done a very good job of explaining how well financed this would have to have been, how well orchestrated. It begs the question, if not Osama bin Laden, then who?
Then who? Nick, from the very beginning, the Taliban officials, Afghani officials have said, we had nothing to do with this, Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with this. How do you hear that? Was there any nuance in the language that sent a different message that maybe the rest of us might not have heard? Well, perhaps we have lost at least the audio portion here. Jamie McIntyre has been outside the Pentagon. Jamie, can you hear us?
I do hear you.
Are you hearing anything from the Pentagon, wherever the Pentagon might literally be right now, or at least officials, about whether there is an American involvement in what we are looking at in Afghanistan?
I have talked to several senior officials, and they've told me they are not aware of whether or not this is a U.S. military strike, but the most senior officials are in the Pentagon. And in fact, several busloads of reporters are being taken over now to the Pentagon briefing room, where we expect shortly Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, flanked by the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Carl Levin and Senator John Warner, to brief us on developments today. And if this is in fact a military strike or part of a U.S. retaliation, we would expect that Secretary Rumsfeld would tell us at that time. Secretary Rumsfeld has been in the Pentagon all day. He went outside briefly to make an inspection tour of the damage behind me. Many casualties here today, but the Pentagon is refusing to give any numbers or even estimates of how many people were killed and injured in this terrorist attack today here at the Pentagon. But again, no confirmation at this point from any of the officials that I've talked to about whether what we're seeing in Afghanistan is part of a U.S. military retaliation.
Jamie, just to make sure that I've heard this correctly, no one is saying yes it is, but no one has said to you no it's not either, have they?
No, no one has steered us away from it. The officials who have been over here with the press, and we're just about half a mile or so from the Pentagon, simply said that they had not been briefed and were not aware of this action when we told them that CNN was reporting explosions in Kabul. So But again, several officials speculated that if this were the case, that might explain